My guest this week is Carlos Grasso. Carlos is a New Orleans-based visual artist, composer, musician, and DJ. He was formerly the creative services director for 80s alt record label I.R.S. Records and served as the co-creator and producer of the label's MTV music series, The Cutting Edge. After leaving I.R.S., he became a music video director before embarking on his current interests. The founder of the live film scoring project Asphalt Serenade, Carlos is also currently fronting the neo-exotica ensemble Pink Teddy Bear. He's a partner in Sui Generis Music, a small record label focused on one-of-a-kind artists, and is also a sound and electronic artist who's performed in Los Angeles and New Orleans. And when he DJs from his extensive vinyl and CD collection, it is under the moniker DJ Jump Cut. And it is my great pleasure to welcome to Revolutions Per Movie this week, Carlos Grasso. Hi, Carlos.
Hi. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I am honored. Part of the exciting thing about doing this podcast is getting to meet people who have subconsciously been in my life. I've seen your name on so many things that have resonated with me and kind of made me who I am. Were you at I.R.S. Records from the get-go when Jay and Miles were putting it together? How did you end up at I.R.S.?
Yes, actually I was. I guess I could be considered the first employee. It ended up being a kind of a minor partner, but I was the first one in terms of the Los Angeles, which was what I.R.S. America. And that came about because Jay and I were in college together.
Oh, wow.
And I would design posters and flyers for shows that he was booking there. He was booking at the university at the time. And then mysteriously I started getting these odd things in the mails of pictures of the Cramps or the Buzzcocks, and with no return or no explanation or something. And then finally, I don't know, a week or two later, Jay calls me up and says what'd you think of the stuff I sent you? It's well, this is great, but what's up? He says, well, I'm starting this, getting this record label going with this guy, Miles Copeland, the manager of the Police. And I could really use an art director over there. Are you interested? And I said, sure. What does it pay? And he said, I think it was $25 a week. And I said, sounds like a ton of money to me. So off it went. So essentially over the course of the first few months, he and I were the first two people basically in this little bungalow on the A&M lot.
Right.
Starting to turn out the first releases.
That's amazing. Was Faulty was that the UK branch of I.R.S.?
Yes. Well, that would have been more illegal records.
Illegal, okay.
Faulty too. At that time they were more of a distributor.
Okay.
In England, while Illegal Records was essentially the record label, which is what the first Police, I think, single was on, and the first Squeeze songs. Those came out through Faulty Products, and a couple of them on Illegal Records.
CIA was the booking agent, correct? For the bands. You had I.R.S. as the label.
FBI.
Right. All right. FBI. Then you had I.R.S. Then you had the Police. Yeah, it was kind of weird to put all that together, and it was like this weird government vibe on things. Did you help come up with the identity of I.R.S., the man with the sunglasses? Because originally it was kind of a rainbow looking thing on the labels.
I did.
Okay.
Yeah, I did. We decided that since we need our own sort of logo here of some sort, something to identify us. Miles wasn't so into it at first, but then he said, well, if it's anything, it has to be some kind of an agent, in keeping along with all the other governmental things that he was involved with. So essentially I just came up with this, this idea, John Guarnieri, who was originally worked there as well. We were just kind of batting around things, and then I just started looking through magazines, and before I knew it, let me grab something. There was this.
Oh my God.
Which is the original, if you can see it.
Yeah, absolutely.
The original pencil drawing I made of the little guy.
That is incredible.
Kind of pretty close to what he's like now.
Yeah. What was that? What was your influence? Was it just from your head? Was it like a noir film? Was it just a stereotype?
It was a combination of that and stereotype. Then looking at the time through different old magazines, oh, look at that guy with that hat on. He needs a hat. So just starting to copy elements from other elements, and then essentially ended up with that.
That's amazing. I have a couple records here I wanted to show you and hopefully maybe get your thoughts on before we move into the cutting edge. For instance, Psychedelic
Oh,
Jungle by the Cramps.
yes,
Do you have
yes.
any thoughts on this one at all in terms of?
Well, the thing about that is they were the Cramps are just like, first of all, they were really great to work with. They're really nice and polite and just, so dedicated to what they were doing that it was really easy to work with them. And because they had already said such a strong vision of who they were, that it was pretty much when it came to any covers, it was easy to be able to piece things together because, they'd usually provide like a photograph,
Okay.
to me, and then I just go from there in terms of a layout and, wanting it to stick to their aesthetics, so to speak.
Early on, were the names of art directors often included in things, or was that kind of like they wanted to keep, like, we don't want to see how this is made, like we don't want to give too much away?
Yeah, I think it's been a thing, but it's been a thing, and pretty much not till after the 70s, as it were. It was much more common to see the art directors' names. But records do go back to the 50s and 60s, especially when they were on boutique-ish labels like Command or those things, where the art director was important because the covers were very distinctive.
Sure.
Some jazz labels were like that.
Well, here's a twofer. Call
Oh
Call the
wow.
West and the Mexican Radio 12-inch with the
Yeah.
baby
Oh
heads.
wow. Wow.
Super iconic cover.
Uh-huh.
What was that? Did Stan help come up with the identity of this, or where'd you guys go with this?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Stan Ridgway. And there was also this photographer, Francis D'Elia, who actually directed the Mexican Radio video,
Oh, amazing.
who essentially, but he was pretty much, Stan was very, very always really singularly, in his head, he already had, I have an idea of what I need this to feel like. And there was something
Okay.
about that door, that call of the West, as it were, out in that kind of a landscape that, so pretty much what I did would just support whatever it is they wanted to go through and then just add, I'd add type and all of that later. But the 12-inch, I worked pretty closely because that I knew specifically what I wanted to photograph, and it was that garden.
Yeah, it's amazing.
That somebody maintained. It was full of just amazing things. So said that needs to be the cover for, that maxi single, basically.
And then, of course, like the typography on Murmur,
Mm-hmm.
and like when you get something like kudzu or whatever from a band, and you're like, they're like, this is what it's going to be, and we're not going to say who's on it, and it's like a
Right,
trestle.
right.
Would you get excited about it? Was there ever pushback from the label to be like, this is too much?
Well, of course. Yeah, of course it was. And it was not so much internal. Some Miles would be completely happy that, like, where's the band? Where are they? There's no,
Right.
just where the police were, how they were positioning themselves aesthetically. And then certainly the label A&M, there was a couple of times when it was just like, what is this? This is too oblique. And which to me, it was saying to me, and which I already understood from the get go with them, especially, it's like, this is actually, if you forget, this is a new kind of music right now, and they're wanting to, and they know who their audience want, what they want them to be,
Yes.
and this is the way they present themselves to that audience to go, I am interested in this because that's where I was at,
Yes,
and
absolutely.
so I never felt it's like, you guys got to have a picture on the cover, this way with some fad, but it never felt that way. If it made sense for the band, if that's what they really were after, fine. But it was always my ethos to go along with what is this band, not to apply just to like, well, this is the IRS Records way of covers that we do. It's more like each was an individual and each deserved to be dealt with however they want to deal with it. And I didn't care what pushback I got. I would just kind of fight it and just say, this is them, leave them alone.
No, I love that labels could have a visual identity, even if like Roman gods didn't look like, you know, jerky versions of the dreams. That was called jerky.
Yeah.
It's just like everything had its own vibe. But when you flipped it over and saw that it was an IRS record, or, you were
Yeah.
like, oh, of course, it
Mhm.
did have a style that was, some of it was kind of haunted, I feel like, kind of like, you
Yes.
would stare at it and be like, what? I remember I picked up the first R.E.M thing I picked up was the I.R.S version of Radio Free Europe, which had the little figure on it, but you flipped it
Right.
over on the back. It said left from right, Mike, Bill, Michael, Peter, and it was pictures of llamas And you're just like looking at it going like, what is this? Was it hard to get musicians to get the ideas in their head out to you to see it to the finish line?
Not usually. Not usually it was too difficult. I think because they ended up trusting me quite a bit. Because basically when we would, I would always consider myself an artist first in that sense when I was at the label.
Sure.
So I would speak to a lot of them. We would be speaking in the same language. And I wasn't speaking in the language of, I suppose, the bigger label art director because I didn't know what that was.
Right.
I only knew what this was, on this level. And so it was easier for the artist to relate where they could just tell me ideas and say, here are these pieces I have, or they might not have anything and I'd have to start from scratch. But I got where they were. All we would need would be a minute or two conversation and I'd get what they were after. So it wasn't really ever that difficult to make it work.
No, I mean,
It
if
really
you've
was.
got someone as weird looking as Scawfish, you're just like, all right, put him on the
Yeah,
cover.
yes,
You
this
know?
is where we go.
And it's gonna either sell or it's not gonna sell, but
Yeah.
nothing else is gonna look like
Yeah.
this.
Well, again, it was part of the overall that punk post-punk of, we're not going to be selling ourselves upon these these images and the way bands have been selling themselves for the past several decades.
Right.
We're coming from the anti, front person, but of course, then that creates that very identifiable icon for each and every single band. None of them is like the other.
Did you have any other graphic artists or labels that you took inspiration from or were like, oh, I would really like to get to that level with what we're doing?
Oh, absolutely. There were several, I think, labels that I'd always be sitting going like, well, I'd really like to get there. I'd really like to be able to explore, on that level. I think a lot of the stuff that, I would say any SST label, any record, any 4AD, any Rough Trade, any of those. There was Neville, what was his name? His last name is English record cover designer. There are things like that, and certainly a lot of the ones that look like, that work with the Buzzcocks and
Sure.
a lot of those artists. Those were absolutely, and that's interesting you say that because it would tug at a different part of me that in one sense, but I don't have we are putting out so many records that I've got like literally just a few days before I have to get going on the next one.
So the turnaround was tight.
We were churning out a lot of things, and especially when Faulty Products then got added into the mix and other labels, there was just a lot on top of the advertising, on top of because for a while there I was by myself, so essentially I would have to produce everything, and so that would leave me with that amount of time. Not that I feel at all like, oh, if I could have done better. It has nothing to do with that at all. It's like that's what that was. You had to pop out these things fast.
Amazing.
And couldn't really afford to sit down there except for a couple projects where I was able to take it home and say, well, I'll really work on this. There was a Buzzcocks, a 3-song 12-inch that we made that I painted. And
You mean this one right here?
yes, and those ones was important for me to work on.
You painted that.
Yes.
Amazing.
So I started off as a painter, so
Okay.
it was important for me to like, well, I want to go there with this because I have some time. They've given me some time here. But in general, I'm really happy with the way everything ends up because it ended up identifiable. And I feel when you pull up these covers that seem like, oh gosh, it's still work over the course of time.
Totally.
Because they're basically simple.
Yeah.
Basically, try to keep them, not very elaborate. We weren't doing Sgt. Pepper's covers and
Right.
things of that nature. They were basically kept simple. Like everything was as if it was a telephone pole flyer kind of a thing.
And I would stare at these things for hours, I mean, just looking at them and trying to see if there's anything that I'm missing in it. Those Buzzcocks things, they're broken up, when these were coming out. And so it had a different kind of feel to it. Even, like I'm reading into it like, oh, there's probably some message between this orange, blue, and yellow and green. Like maybe it signifies each member or something. I was young, like it was fun.
Yeah.
It was fun to have that thing going on in my head.
Absolutely.
And R.E.M. were also like the masters of it in terms of you could really lose yourself in the iconography of of what they were putting out and trying to
Yeah.
establish their identity.
Yeah.
Before 120 Minutes started, I was really lucky. We had cable in our town really early. And I remember there was the thing called the I.R.S. show that predated it that was hosted by Jules Holland.
Hmm.
And it was like had footage of like the IRS offices, and they were talking to people working there, and then they were interviewing like the Cramps and Oingo Boingo and Wall of
Right.
Voodoo. Do you remember how that even came about? Because that's like a really weird little mini documentary.
It was originally, those originally grew out of, Miles had started a show that Jules was the host of in England called Rebellious
Oh,
Jukebox.
right. Okay.
And it was sort of a, different acts, performing on either a little stage they had with Jules hosting in between pieces. And then Miles wanted to do another pilot. That was actually, I think, the one you saw was probably the pilot, where then it was like, well, I'll give now to this. He was looking to get kind of a backhanded way of giving IRS Records a a visibility,
Yeah,
through that.
it totally worked. That's where I first saw Wall of Voodoo doing Call Box at 123
Yeah.
and
Yes.
Crack the Bell, and I just was like, what? And I remember
Yeah.
I got it here. Stan Ridgway has kind of a fight with Jules Holland at the end of it too. Do you remember this?
Yes, I do.
He's basically just taking Jules Holland to task for kind of. I mean, he had just such a different vibe. He's kind of like a fake swarmy kind of thing, trying to be larger than life. And Stan Ridgway is he's like, no, I'm really serious. You have your own band. You have your own thing going. What the fuck are you going around here? Why are you doing this? Because you're getting paid, right? You're not interested in the bands. You have no idea who they are or who they're doing. I mean, am I wrong? Isn't it a little shallow? And Jules Holland's like, no, you're right. It's just like such a weird way to end this thing that up to that point had been really like, oh, I'm interviewing the bands and here it is. And it's, you
Yeah.
just took it in.
Yeah.
I fell in love with that right away. And Belinda Carlisle standing next to them laughing really nervously. And it just
Right.
put an edge on it that I really appreciated
Yeah.
that I hadn't seen on
Right.
MTV up to that point.
Yeah.
IRS is the Cutting Edge came out of this. Was this almost like an audition?
No, not really. It was actually nearly about the same time.
Okay.
And it's because Miles had gone to MTV separately, and pitched them, said, like, I want to do this music show here in America, and it's by our label, and we're going to feature new bands, and that's all he told them.
Right.
And they said, sure, that sounds great, because I guess that was what would have been 1982, 3, and the police had a lot of clout, so he was able to get that in there. So that grew independently. That other thing was happening at about the same time.
Yeah, it was so smart because I was not a fan of the Police, but my heavy metal friends loved the Police. And the very
Mhm.
first episode of IRS is the Cutting Edge had a world premiere of Every Breath You Take on it, but it
Mhm.
also shoehorned the Radio Free Europe video, the
Yeah.
original one before they had any live footage. And I remember that came on, and my friends just being like, this sucks. What is this? And I was kind of like, yeah, this is weird. Because I was a synthesizer kid up to that point, right?
Right.
And then it kept playing the commercial through it, like Murmur on IRS Records, and it bang, bang, bang. And I just was like, I think I love it. And the next day I went downtown and got that single I was telling you about and flipped it over. And it was so masterful at, here's something that the label, it was like free. I mean, not free, obviously there's a ton of work in what you did, but it was IRS programming with other labels involved and other artists. And really, I can't imagine that happening nowadays. It seems like it'd be really hard for a label to be like, hey, just give us an hour every last Sunday.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, imagine it probably would be easier in a sense if you just set it up on your own via just on the web.
Right.
I suppose that would be a different. But no, I think we were the only people that were candid with it. They were able to pull that out because we were able to stride the line. Our acts had credibility, so even if we put them on there, it wasn't going to strain the situation. Because it was always important, particularly from my involvement where I was in it is like this: if we don't maintain this balance, and actually it skews a little bit more towards the scene
Right.
and less so much, to us, then that will maintain that, that'll maintain essentially what I wanted at the time, which was credibility to this program. That you could watch and not feel you were getting, stuff just shoved down your throat.
It was amazing. I know people talk about 120 minutes, but I think I.R.S. Cutting Edge just blew it away. I mean, some of the bands that I saw in there was the Saints, the Replacements, who had shaved their eyebrows for that interview,
Right.
Warren
Right.
Zevon, X, The Fall, Los Lobos, Slayer, Let's Active,
Yeah.
Morrissey, who was answering questions from the audience, the 3 O'Clock, Hoodoo Gurus, Squeeze, Daniel Johnston, Glass Eye, Henry Rollins, Lydia Lunch, Jonathan Richman, Ann Magnuson, Tom Waits, John Sex, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Flat Duo Jets, The Flesh Tones, Circle Jerks, Stiv Baders, Grandmaster Flash, Husker Du, Minutemen, Meat Puppets, Rita Marley, Muda Baruka, Howard Devoto, Robin Hitchcock, Nona Hendrix, Dream Syndicate, Depeche Mode. It was
Wow. Wow.
amazing how influential it was. And as a kid, I have him here. I wrote letters to you and Jessica Hooper at IRS's Cutting Edge, and I have the letters here. And
Wow.
so I,
That's
I'd get
incredible.
home and I would say, I'd write a letter like this. I just got back from Portland making my rounds in the record stores. When I got home, my brother rushed up to me with a package. I saw the bold I.R.S. label and rushed and opened it. The first thing I pulled out was a cassette, the Flesh Tones' new cassette. And there was even more. Pictures of my faves, Wall of Voodoo and R.E.M., and I still haven't gotten over it. I think it's great that you have a closeness with the bands and the company, and I think it's also great that you take care of the fans out there in record buying land. Keep using tikis, and thank you from me for being the greatest record company now and forever. Thanks, your loyal fan of I.R.S. And then right here I wrote, how do I get a job at I.R.S? And I put I wrote down all the band names on it and stuff.
Okay, I kind of remember that. Wow.
Yeah, so you
You
guys
can
were
think with
so
that,
kind.
huh?
I would just that was the era where you just would write. You'd be like, "There's an ad. There's a
Yeah.
PO box. I'm just going to send something off."
Yeah.
And but I, for somebody who was just living in the suburbs, it really meant a lot, that show,
Yeah.
and also
Yeah. Right.
just having a label be like, here's a Flesh Tone cassette, check it out. It was
Yeah.
such a direct line. Did you know that you were making a difference out there for fans?
Well, not, it's like in anything. A lot of times you're in the kind of in the middle of something. Sometimes you're not as aware, but a lot of people and a lot of bands, as the show went, particularly as the more episodes we showed and get around, it was almost surprising because you kind of assume that really that nobody's watching. It's like there's like 10 people out there, right? And so, yeah, it would come as a bit of a shock when people were so taken by it and kept, so they keep going with us. Don't let us down out here. We need this. Us a lot were from people that considered themselves to be. I'm in the hinterlands. I live in this little town outside of Missouri where there's nothing, and this is what keeps me going.
Absolutely, I was right there with it.
Yeah, and that was fabulous. That was precisely not not precise, but who we were and who we were after. It's like we want to be communicated with, so let's communicate with those that are, that are like-minded, as it were.
So, what was the process? You had two directors early on. You had Jonathan Davis and Valerie Faris, who went on to do like Mr. Show and Little Miss
Mhm.
Sunshine.
Mhm.
What was the process of making an episode?
Well, the first thing that started off, I mean, they were friends from college, and going back to Miles. Miles, basically, the way that started internally is he literally walked into my office and said, "I got us an hour of, MTV, make a show." I was out there literally stunned, like, "Well, what kind of show?" It's like, "I don't know, it's music, stuff, call the Cutting Edge." That's it, and that's all we got. And, and I had somewhat of a film background, and Jonathan and Valerie, they were filmmakers at UCLA, but it didn't mean none of us knew how to make a TV show. We worked on commercials together and things like that for the label. So in a way, we just sort of sat down and decided, well, these are the important elements that this should have. It should be anything but that, anything but that. What MTV was doing at the time, we need this to communicate really quite directly. And it was really, I said, Jonathan and Valerie's, as filmmakers, that they're the one who came to concept of being able to fashion these special little
Yeah,
pieces
they're like mini documentaries.
around each artist. That it wasn't just talking to them, but it was in a place or doing something that said more, and that just made it more fun to do, rather than, we didn't want to sit there with like a talking head just interviewing bands. That didn't seem like it was going to get us anywhere. So it just kept developing, and it's one of those things, like a lot of things of creative. At one point it just decides on its own. This is where we're going. This is where I'm going, and then you just follow that. So it was definitely one of those situations for sure.
It felt like there was a lot of work invested in it because you were taking bands and being like, let's take the Flesh Tones to cook hamburgers, or
Yeah.
we're going to have Stiv Bators and a minister have a
Right.
debate
Yeah.
about religion, or we're going to go to Lux and Ivy's house and get a tour. There's a great sequence in the New York episode that has like John Sex and Craig Vandenberg playing
Right.
Tony LaVentura.
Yeah.
And they go to that, I think it's, I can't remember what the hotel name is, the Icarus or
Oh, the Iroquois.
Iroquois.
Yeah,
And they
Iroquois.
talk to the two gentlemen who work there, and they're so amazing. I could have watched a documentary about them for hours. They're like, oh, the Clash, they come in here, they're good boys.
Yeah.
R.E.M, they're nice. I don't know what a R.E.M is.
Yeah.
And it's just, all these were such great snapshots of scenes, Austin, New Orleans, that were still really underground.
Yeah.
And hadn't become a beacon yet.
No.
I think it was amazing.
Yeah. It was fun, that part, because you felt like you were able to bring some things, to the TV screen, that, well, we know this world, and here it is, and this is what comes out of this world. These are the people, and they create from this world, that kind of a thing.
Originally, it was Jeffrey Valens was the host, and he did infiltration art, I think is what they called it. And I remember reading about him in research, and then he kind of just disappeared. But I thought he was a great host. He was just really, just so mellow. And Peter Zaremba had such a confidence. What happened with Jeffrey? Did he eventually just throw himself into more art?
Oh, yeah. Well, he'd always been a very, very serious artist. That was his number one thing in life. This host thing was really just something. He happened to be a friend of Jonathan and Valerie's, and they asked him. I was like, again, he was so sort of charmingly awkward.
Yes, he was great.
And I kind of liked it. It's like, well, it's sort of just, he's obviously not particularly comfortable or even very, he hasn't done this a lot. But that was okay. It was fine. But he really went on to our career just blossomed and blossomed. And I think he's also professor, of art. So he certainly has maintained his arc, as it were, as far as an artist and what he's done. And he's an incredible artist and continues to be.
I always feel like Jeffrey and Peter are the two different record store clerks. Jeffrey was the one who would be very sweet about what you got, and would be like, oh, this is really, I haven't heard that. Yeah, this is going to be cool. And Peter would be like, hey, kid.
Yeah.
This is not the real stuff. Let me go over here and show you. You should be listening to this instead.
Yes.
And I love that about them. And I think Peter obviously ended up being like the quintessential host, just so iconic and natural with it. How did you end up writing those scripts, and how did Peter end up reading those so naturally? I mean, did you guys use cue cards, or what was going on?
No, it was one of those things where I don't think he'd seen himself as a host originally, but him and I became very good friends. It was one of the close relationships from the label that I had and have, was him. And because I liked his personality so much, I just think he would be great with the pushback. But he was such a spontaneous and really so highly intelligent.
Yes.
And really good at ad-libbing, that in one sense we'd sit down and come up with a theme, and I would write dialogue and write, a sort of, half a script. And then he would just essentially take that and mangle that up, add his own parts to it. And he would only a couple times need a little prompting. But for the most part, once we were in the segment, he was running with it. And frankly, there were times when he would just end up going off the script, and it's like, oh, this is great. So what does it matter?
Oh, his energy was amazing. And also his choice of what to enunciate and put the emphasis on was always a little off, and I love that. Like, he was just one of the greatest cheerleaders of music. He just felt like he was really excited, and
Yeah.
that you could really pick up on that.
Yes.
When you came up with this title sequence, what was that like? Because that is one of my favorite, 1 minute of film, or art video or whatever you want to call it ever.
Well, I have this friend, Douglas Martin, who was a filmmaker, artist, friend. And then when it was time to do the title sequence, and kind of we all knew them, Jonathan Valley from around the way. We just felt that their style was like, they're going to come up with something really. And he worked on Go-Go's cover.
Okay.
They're going to come up with something really, really interesting for this. And he had pitched this in of the, as soon as he said, the martini glass with a ball, it's like great. So we just said, just go with it. And yeah, it was. It's one of my favorite things about the show is that title sequence, and it kind of fits the show so well.
It does, because it didn't necessarily visually represent anything you were going to see. It wasn't like, oh, I'm going to see a mohawk or a goth person or even a hipster, like a guy in a turtleneck winking while a ball goes into the thing. But the Clark Kent song was such a great pick. It just you heard it and you were in. It always was such a great call to arms. Once you're in and you're seeing who was going to be on it, you'd be like, oh, Specimen. What's Specimen?
Yeah.
How about picking the bands? Because a lot of them weren't IRS bands. Was it complicated to get the rights from other independent or major labels to have their bands appear on this thing?
Not usually. I mean, the process would come around. I would be involved, because quite heavily. And was like, we need to go with this, John. We need to, or this band. Let's put on this band. And Jonathan and Valerie would. Pretty much it would come around as to, what was the word around, pre-internet. Mm-hmm. What was the word around on what band? Yeah, I like that band. And so basically we just then approached them. And more often, unless there was a schedule issue, everybody was really excited because they knew they were going to get something more than just an interview, a straight interview.
Right.
They were going to take the time, especially with an artist with some major labels that like this was the best bit of marketing they were going to get.
Sure.
Out of it was that part. Million households that they normally wouldn't know how to do that on their own, really, to talk to that market.
Some of the stuff you could find, like obviously I.R.S Records and things like that. But some of these bands you had to dig a little deeper to find like a Flat Duo Jets thing,
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah.
Were there any bands that you tried to get that you just couldn't make it work?
Yeah, I became friends for others with David Lovering, the drummer of the Pixies. But there was I was really, because I really loved that band. And so, but it was we couldn't get it to line up with tours and where they were at. And, they probably would have enjoyed it. That was one of the ones that, I would have liked to have had work out, but it just didn't. By the time maybe we're getting close, they broke up.
Right. How long did it take to produce an episode? Because you're having to do this every month.
Month. It would take pretty close to the month.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Just because the show, had a lot more editing than maybe most shows did. So that process would be the bulk. And it was. And because our shoots were more complex, they'd take more planning time, more if we needed props, to permissions, blah, blah, blah. All that would take. So it would take us pretty close to a month to produce each show.
It seems like it. That the amount of work it felt like that was going into it, it was evident because, again, it wasn't just shot like, okay, go into this studio and we're going to film you. It's just all over the cities you were visiting, and also a lot of LA that's just gone, or parts of New York that are gone. Do you have any favorite sequences?
I think the standout ones for me, I think there's the Austin show. The Austin show is a big one for me, just because it was because of what was happening in Austin at that time and how feverish it was. And I made some great relationships out of that show. And there were things like that to this day became like with Daniel Johnston, for example, where, that was one that it's kind of unforgettable. I went to see this a local festival, and he runs up to me and he's like, I'm like Daniel Johnston. "Hi, how are you?" And that's what he said, and then points his cassette, which is "Hi, how are you?" And we became friends. And as soon as I heard his music, I thought, I've never heard anything in this current climate. I could hear the influences that he was a Beatles fanatic, for sure. But there were those kinds of special sort of artists like that I do take with me as far as, certain things that stick out. Another one would be when Alex Chilton performed "The Letter" in the cemetery here in New Orleans. And that's just like he's playing the song. And I almost wanted to cry
It's amazing.
just because it's just so amazing. It's like, and then what made me feel about that, it's like, nowhere else, no other show would you see this. This guy
No.
doing this song at the cemetery, here. So there's not, there's a lot, but there's some of those that, that really, really stick out. And most of the stuff that Peter does.
Yeah. I saw the Austin show in real time when it came out, and I remember the Daniel Johnston thing just being just electrifying.
Yeah,
You would have no idea that he was not known or established in that
right,
scene, or that,
right.
he kind of just was kind of pushed on stage to do his thing as at a last minute
Yeah,
thing. A lot of the cutting edge stuff I want to see again has been really hard to track down, like Dream Syndicate singing, The Medicine Show, or the Husker Du episode with Muda Baruka, or Daniel Johnston performing the second time on the cutting edge. And I remember Peter saying, "We got so many letters about this guy, Daniel Johnston. Who is he? What is he? We're here to show you another thing." And I remember it's like in an apartment, and he kind of comes out from behind a curtain, and it's
yeah,
the feel of it is so different than the
yeah,
previous thing. And I remember being like,
yeah.
"Oh, okay, what is this?" I can't find it on YouTube. Where did the archives of this end up? What's happened with this?
That's a very, very good question. And because we were so, in a way, well, we're making a show, but we were a bit slapdash in our back end of it. By that I mean properly, keeping and maintaining a library of masters of all the episodes. And then because when the label started going, the label itself started going under, essentially, unless whatever it is I'd saved or what Jonathan Valerie might have saved or anything, what happened was many of the masters were probably thrown out when IRS dissolved, and essentially. And at that time, I was away from it. And if I'd have known that was going to happen, I would have gone in there and rescued them. I would
Right.
just assume this stuff would be going along with it. So in essence, really, what's left, MTV probably has some masters, but they're it's next to impossible to you know get to that. So really, it's relied on me putting together, and whatever masters I was able to save that I've just kept with me. And I made Betamaxes, getting a copy of each one. So I went through, all those ones and was able to pull up the ones, well, these are the episodes that are still look okay that I can fix.
Yeah.
So I've been actually going on this very long process, of which on Instagram we have a cutting edge. We're essentially, and I'm only up to like 3 episodes.
Oh, but I appreciate it.
I'm restoring them. I put up the New Orleans one. There's the Austin one, and I think the next one is the New York one.
The New York one, yeah, because Grandmaster Flash is in it,
Yes.
and John Sex and the Peppermint Lounge.
Yeah, all that stuff. So I'm a little, between everything else, like, well, I better get another, episode up and restored. They take a little while, but
Sure.
eventually I'll get there with them, because when I do end up watching them afterwards, they're like, wow, that's amazing that's on there. Like the one right now I'm hoping will show up would be one of the very first shows we did. And we had, because we were the first show that featured rap. I thought really heavily that it's like, this hip hop and rap, this is part of this new music scene. This has to be part of what we're doing, because I don't know about you, but there'd be a lot of punk bands I'd see in LA who were playing with rap acts
Yeah.
as the openers. To me, it's like, this is the same music,
Yeah.
these two. And so one unforgettable was Grandmaster Flash doing essentially a demonstration of, how to scratch using record players. And it's just unforgettable to me. Just like, but he's doing it with these record players with a Michael Jackson song, and off he's going. But hopefully we'll get those, hopefully all those will, not all of them. I have no idea if we'll be able to get to all the episodes.
Sure.
I would say I have probably 2/3,
Oh, that's amazing.
of them, which is probably better. So it's a little bit of a regret when I sit here later. It's like, well, if we'd had a little bit more patience, we probably should have saved these and contracts. So maybe in a way, there's a certain mystique or
Yeah.
mystery that I guess around the cutting edge. Because when I do look up things, partially it's why I've been restoring and putting them up, is because I'd find bits and it's like, wow, somebody literally videotaped this off the TV screen. And it just looks terrible. I'm going to put up the right version of, blah, 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 POA,
Right.
blah, blah, but people should see this in the way it's supposed to sound and look.
Jeffrey Valance, he has a YouTube page, and all he had was his sequences introducing stuff on it.
Yeah.
And it just was driving me crazy. He's like, I think he's like with Rita Marley and like Jamaica.
Right, yes.
And I'm just like, wait, but you're not going to show us so it made me wonder, like, I wonder if he has this stuff, but it is a total rabbit hole to go down. And in the show notes, I will put links to all of Carlos's art and music and also to the cutting edge stuff too. So the show went from 83 to 87. Was it your choice to kind of be like, okay, I think we're kind of done here? Or was it more of like, oh, we're getting notes that maybe MTV wants to use this hour for something else?
No, I think it was one of those things. It was a combination. We made a shift in the show because Jonathan and Valerie decided, it was time for us to move on to other frontiers. And they were so intertwined with its look and its approach that I didn't want to stop the show. But at the same time, it was like, well, this is going to have to be different because we're not going to be able to repeat. We shouldn't even try to be repeating exactly, And so I decided to go in a different direction, which was then the cutting edge happy hour and more what was a live presentation of the program. I felt like that was where things were going, and eventually MTV did more of that. Because after that, that they were doing their acoustic live sit-ins, but it was after we were already doing that. I would say it was not. It was a really good idea to go in that direction, but we didn't execute it in a way that made it work because we got a lot of complaints. Because it also shifted I made a shift in there's kind of new electronic music kind of coming up. It seems to be percolating as a new scene.
Right.
Well, when I put some of that on, boy, oh boy, did that cause the hardcores. It was like, what the fuck are you doing?
We just got into guitars. How can you bring us?
Why are you playing this? But I was, but the one thing is as an artist and a person, it's like, I got to move on too.
Yeah, totally.
And so in the long run, Peter was a host, and I just realized at that point, it's like, look, it had its run, and we should leave it with that and stop trying to beat this into something else because we're struggling. What we're thinking about having to come up with things more for it to be different than the old one, yet without, sometimes it's like, it was just at that point, it was just not worth those. That kind of a challenge, it's time to move on.
Sure. No, the last episode, I remember being really heartbroken. It takes place at they're having an IRS garage sale.
My parents' house, yeah.
Oh, really? Amazing. And then somebody's like, get out of here. Like, what are you doing here?
That's me.
Okay. I didn't know it was you. That's great.
Yeah.
And then Peter, I thought it was so beautiful. He goes, the sun is setting over the cutting edge. There are a lot of skeptics saying you can't shoot an exciting guerrilla-style new music show on a high school budget. These skeptics were correct. At a time when every unisex hair salon around the country and every second-rate hard rock radio program is calling themselves the true cutting edge, I do believe it is indeed time to pack up and go home. Ha! Now where are you going to watch, huh? And he walks away. I was like, what?
Yeah, I know.
It was like a hug and also a bit of a middle finger.
A little bit. Yeah, I think a little bit.
Amazing.
Yeah, it was.
And so when did you start? You moved into music videos then?
Yeah, because I was already starting to direct, some videos for people anyway, for some of the bands. I'd done filmmaker when I was young, and that was part of my I suppose for lack of a better word, closeted art world of that and music and whatnot. And so because I've become close with a lot of bands and labels, and I just started getting asked.
Right.
And that just led to like, well, it's time for me actually to move on, actually just from I.R.S. for various reasons.
Right.
Where it was just, I just felt this, it's just moving in directions that and I feel like I've done what I needed to do here. And I tend to work that way. It's like, I'm not going to just keep pushing this in, and I certainly don't want to be here 20 years.
Right.
It was time to move on. I felt other tugs beginning to pull at me that said it's time to start moving, and even towards music videos. And that became more of after a while, that became then like excruciating. It's a weird thing to say, which is a wonderful world. Because after a while, it's like, oh man, I cannot stomach listening to this song that they really want me to make this video for. And I have to listen to this piece of shit and decide what the hell is going to be any good. And of course, those would be my very worst videos.
Right. Because you were doing like Camper Van Beethoven and Stan Ridgway.
Well, yeah, and Cracker. All those people were people that's like, this is music I love.
Did you do Oasis?
Yes, an Oasis video.
Wow. That must have been hard.
Well, it was a combination of like, more like surprising.
Okay.
But they were really rated quite nice and a hell of a lot of fun.
Oh, cool.
They were a lot. There was like the early part when they were just beginning to, so they were
okay.
Much more. Let me put this. They were very dynamic in their personalities.
Right.
But so I started working with a lot of really, really good bands that was starting to move somewhere. But then even after that, particularly since at that point it was expected, like, well, now it's time to move into commercials. And something was tugging deep down that was saying, like, I don't know if that's what you want, even with the money, is that what you really want to do? And it's interesting because it's something that was inspired by being at I.R.S. I will say that when I look back on that part, it was certainly, I started off as a kid wanting to be in a band. And so what I became in one sense, and I don't want this to sound at all, it's like, well, this is the closest I'll get right now. So I'm going to work with other bands, making their vision or those things happen. And that's absolutely was wonderful. I couldn't have asked for a better, but there was a point there where it just became like, this thing that's tugging will not let go.
Right.
And so I have to just follow it from this end and put these other parts together to get there. But it's still related to if I'd not met a lot of those musicians and people there, the Stan Ridgways, the Peters, all those people, if I'd not met them or known them, I would not be doing this.
Yes.
Where I'm at with where I've pushed to, I wouldn't. It was their inspiration and support a lot of times with many Pat McDonald's who like, sounds like you need to start going for it.
Right.
In a different manner other than, but again, it's still, all those experiences from I.R.S. and the cutting edge, they're also a part of my DNA, as it were, if that's a way to put it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's what's great about especially this era of music is that it was a lot of ripple effects, and it was really easy to meet these people and to get inspired by them and write a letter to a record label and have them write back. I mean, it just was a really lovely time. If you were into music and it was something you wanted to be attached to, I had no shame just saying, like, how can I work at I.R.S. Records, right?
Yeah.
When you're 15, right? Because you're so excited. And I think the great thing about the label and the cutting edge was it threw it back on the audience in such a great way in terms of just, if you're going to put as much effort into loving it, we're going to do the same back to you.
That was important. And the other part, I think, is with the cutting edge and the label, is the important part was like, and I think even from the artist, and that was the ethos at the time, it's like, you can do this too.
Absolutely.
Which is why we would have segments that would be like how to make a record. I don't think anybody had ever had something that simple, like, here's how you make a record. You write these songs, you go in the studio, do you do this, get started. And that was the important part. And that was the exciting part, is sharing, pre-internet, sharing information on how to do something. Because none of the people that we work with those artists that I loved, none of them had the manifestation of being a rock star or something. The more important to them was to remain true to who they were And that means that was the main message to get out. Just be true to who you are. You decide where you're going to go and then make it happen. People would forever, when I was directing, would ask me, how do you become a director? As if there was some sort of magic. And I said, like, you pick up a camera, you go shoot something, you put it together, you're a director.
Right.
That action makes you a director. There's no other secret. If you're talking about how do I get into the big time, network or whatever, make really great work that gets noticed. One of the two. But it was surprising how many would ask that question. It was a pretty simple answer.
And you were in LA still at this time.
Yes.
And then on your site, it's so great. You say, he grew tired of that world and in a passive-aggressive fashion self-sabotaged his promising music video career. Which I'm like, well, yeah, I get it all now. So when did you move to New Orleans? And am I saying the city right? Can I say New Orleans? I mean,
New Orleans is mostly it's the most, except New Orleans usually comes because it will rhyme in a song a lot of times.
Okay. I just don't want anyone listening to this just being like, what a moron. Like
the one thing that people do, but we don't, and I'll say this, is Nolans, like,
okay,
cut that out.
Awesome.
This is not Nolans. No one talks like that here. Not even the locals don't speak like that. It's,
that's a scoop. We got a scoop.
New Orleans, New Orleans. It's really, it's just it. But I moved here now about close to 15 years ago now.
I mean, you're still making music, you're DJing, you're doing like live video, you're doing visual art.
And New Orleans is a city that is just it's so easy to be creative and to see your ideas through. It really, really is, because there really isn't there's no major standard like there might be in a bigger city of like, well, you have to reach this standard to be in this group here.
Okay.
But you don't here. It's part of the, it's part of the thing here of like, it's a very tolerant city just all the way around for everything. And so it's really like, its whole thing is make your life and make what interests you. So particularly, it's easy to be surrounded here by this, in terms of, particularly with a musician, it's like whatever movie I stole this one, but you throw a rock and you're going to hit a musician. It's really, it's incredible the amount of musicians that just live here,
right,
that are within a stone's throw on every level, from a kettle drummist to a harp player. It's incredible that it's just, this is the place where people come if you want to play, and that includes different artists. So all those things have a tendency then I wanted to get into the scene here and be motivated by these things. And so with a combination of what was here, then I took my interest from before, which was film, visual arts, and music, and then piped them into, and New Orleans was the city that was easy to make that. It was easier to make that happen here. And be able to go out, because it's easy to I DJ out on the streets in front of this, right on the street.
Amazing.
I just set up in front of the restaurant called Sui Generis, the restaurant, and I just set up because people sit outside. And if I were to try and do that in Los Angeles, another city, I'd need a permit. I'd be out of there, but not New Orleans. I can park my PA out there with my thing and play music outdoors, and nobody's going to bother you, really. So that has a tendency to keep you open,
right,
to whatever your urges or inspirations might be.
Do you feel like economics plays a big part in the vibrancy of like being able to be creative in a city? I mean, you shot that Austin thing at a time where there was no South by Southwest yet. Los Angeles was relatively cheap to live in. New York was still not what it was, like the Village was the Village, and all these cities that I'm talking about have, they're cost prohibitive for a lot of people to be like, I want to be a musician.
Yes.
That's what I'm going to do. And, everybody always had to have part-time jobs and other things. If you were a creative person, you were like, I work at Kinko's and a pizza place, and then I go do this. Do you see that as much of a factor these days in terms of being able to have the freedom to create?
I think, well, it is, and because it's one of those things that while maybe historically to a certain degree, artists have been portrayed as, you lazy people just wake up late and then you make all this stuff and you have this wild kind of and yet art is essentially, you could arguably call it a really great investment, Because as soon as artists move into areas that are cheap to be able to make art, well, all of a sudden that you fill that with a new kind of interesting culture, which starts to then ripple outwards. And then people go, oh, there's this neat thing happening. I want to be part of that. I want to live there in that. And what happens is, of course, it's like they bring up the prices that then drives those artists out. And then you don't have that anymore. Right. You just have the place. You don't, and it happened in downtown Los Angeles when I lived there. It's same thing happened in Austin. It did. A lot of those artists would not be able to. Fortunately, New Orleans and surrounding communities here, there's still places cheap, so then musicians can be able to reasonably do their art. But look at Brooklyn, look at anywhere, and investors should take heed to this. Watch an art scene develop and where it develops, and that's where your investment opportunities are going to be and make a ton of money. Just put some of it back into the artists. So that's what happens. It's just the way it is.
Right. So what are you excited about now? I know you're working on so much stuff, but what is something that you can share with us?
I'm excited right now to be working on this project called Pink Teddy Bear. And it's connected to the restaurant here, Sui Generis. The restaurant here, which is a really unique place. I started DJing there about 6 or 7 years ago, where I would actually perform live electronics and soundscapes as part of the brunches. So there'd be these sort of ambient music brunches, because the owner, Ernie, is a really kind of open to music, and he has this overall vision of music and food being very intertwined.
Cool.
Very intertwined in a way that New Orleans says. And so as he was launching his food empire, as it were, the Tiki Farm, where he grows all these vegetables, and our mutual love of music, he wanted to decide, I want to start a label. So he did. So we said, you want to be part of it? It's okay. I think this is the first time a restaurant has started a label in this city. That makes sense. Yeah. So essentially that part of it, of this food and meets music, we decided, well, that's going to be, what we'll do. And one of the first acts, we have 3 acts. One of the first acts is Pink Teddy Bear, which is actually a banana that grows out at the farm.
Okay.
And essentially took inspiration from the farm, recorded all its sounds, and turned those into instrument patches and things. And so essentially what I ended up doing is writing and putting together what became what essentially is Welcome to the Tiki Farm. And it's almost like, I wouldn't say a throwback, but it recalls old Exotica records, where they would go visit Hawaii and hear the sounds, and then this music would percolate. So we're kind of doing a modern version of that based around the Tiki Farm, music that's kind of, I suppose, Middle Eastern, Latin soundscape, sort of, but all connected to the Tiki Farm. And so that project I like because, well, this is actually something a little new here. A restaurant has started this label. We're a part. All the songs of the record they're all titles of the plants.
Okay.
And vegetables that grow out there. So it's got this sort of earth meets, I don't even know what to call it. And that's exciting because there's also, it'll follow along. It's meant to also be a very audiovisual sensory in terms of our shows. Want to be able to surround us by a virtual screen, as it were.
Right.
Scented programs, we'll capture the smells of the farm and put them in diffusers, background sound. So our shows are meant to be more of an experience, there's a record that's coming out, but they're much more meant to be that kind of a experience, to bring the Tiki Farm to a stage, as it were. So that's the concept. That's the concept around that.
I love it. As soon as you can eat the record, you're going to be complete. Yeah,
I know. That's a great idea. That's a good idea. That's a really good idea.
Carlos, this has been amazing. I always end the interview with the same question, but I tailor it depending on what we're talking about. So on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being the lowest and 10 being the highest, how many blue balls flying through the air and landing in a martini glass that has a goldfish swimming in it do you give I.R.S. the cutting edge? Do you give it 10 balls or 1 ball?
I give it 10 balls.
That is the correct answer. I have it right here. It is 10. You're absolutely correct. I might even give it 12. It was such a thrill to finally get to meet you again. So much you've made has really influenced the way I've made videos, the things that I've wanted to do, the DIY approach. And I love that I went to listen to your music and I was like, this is soundscape. It's really interesting. Like you're using, again, sounds that you're recording in the field. And I'm really excited for you that you are still Carlos Grasso, the artist. It's really cool.
Yeah, because I used to be Carl. Because you remember on some of those covers, those early covers, I was Carl. But then at some point, it's like, that's not a whole other story. But it's like, it's time to be Carlos.
Yeah, I think it's rad. So
thanks so much. It's been a super pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You too.
Thank you for listening to Revolutions Per Movie. We release new episodes every Thursday, so be sure to search for the show on your favorite podcast app and subscribe to the show. And if you've enjoyed this, it would mean a lot to me if you would rate and review it as well. You can follow us on social media at Revolutions Per Movie and also find out more information about our various guests in the episode show notes. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week. Bye!